Well, it won't satisfy Ukraine, and President Zelensky is very impatient. He says that this is a war of time, and we need this time to win. And he's also said that he's not going to be stopping at just demanding tanks. He signaled that he is even going to be asking the NATO countries for F-16 jet fighters. So this is one more step along a very long pathway where Zelensky's really trying to wind up towards having almost the entire panoply of NATO defence gear. You have to admire his ambition and his persistence. I mean, who wouldn't if your country was under existential threat? But this will get a little closer. As you say, it's a good step in the negotiations. It means that presumably if Germany is prepared to let the Poles send some of their Leopard 2 tanks, then they're prepared to allow others as well, because the Ukrainians are saying that there are up to a dozen NATO countries, all of whom have Leopard 2 tanks, all manufactured by Germany, all of whom require an export license from Germany to re-export these tanks to Ukraine, that would export to Ukraine once the Germans say yes. So if they've said yes to the first country, Poland, then they're going to say yes to the others, presumably, and soon you'll have hundreds, perhaps, of these advanced German-made Leopard 2 tanks crossing into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian effort.
While these negotiations are going on, it really is a reminder that while NATO and the EU might be united against Russia, Peter, allies can have competing domestic interests that can complicate the situation.
Yeah, exactly. In the smaller states that are pressed up against Russia's border, Poland, Finland are really pretty hot to trot in terms of arming the Ukrainians and helping the Ukrainians. But Germany, which of course adopted a pacifist constitution after its disastrous experience in World War II, it has to go through a much more difficult and laborious process to get to the same place. So the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, calls it Germany's Zeitenwende, meaning great historical turning point. The moment that the Russian troops crossed into Ukraine, he said, was their Zeitenwende. And so Germany, under Olaf Scholz, which was completely unexpected because he's a left-leaning Chancellor of Germany, has abandoned its pacifist constitution, signalled a huge increase in defence spending, and taken a much more assertive foreign policy and defence policy. And already, even before we get to the Leopard 2 tanks, Germany has sent artillery to Ukraine. Germany has sent missile defence systems to Ukraine. But the Leopard tanks, it's just hesitating. But if you look at where it's come from its pacifist past and its constitution, to get to this point is already a huge transformation, but just not quite as fast as what Zelensky of Ukraine and some of the other frontline countries would like to see from Germany, the dominant power of Europe, of course.
Of course. Meanwhile, Peter, you've written about how foreign tech firms are helping Ukraine gain the upper hand on Russia in cyberspace. How are they doing that?
Yeah, this is a very much a well-kept secret of what some of the big US tech firms have been doing. The one in particular that I reported on in a bit of detail today was Microsoft. And Microsoft has said that when the war began against Ukraine, it was able to see across the networks it had access to a lot of information that the US government wasn't seeing and wasn't relaying quickly enough to Ukraine. And Microsoft decided that it would pass on to Ukraine what it could see. It says, the company Microsoft says, it gets something like 36 trillion bits, signals across the cloud and devices and networks that it can see each day. And from that has been able to divine patterns. For example, they say they've had a regular series of victories, they call it, where they've been able to see the Russians waging a preemptive cyber scoping or cyber attack against a Ukrainian asset or facility, a Ukrainian TV station, for example, or a nuclear plant, and that's been a prelude to a physical kinetic attack, a missile launch, or an artillery attack. And they've been able to get the information to the Ukrainians quickly enough that the Ukrainians can take countermeasures. And Microsoft is saying, we've given services to the value of almost $250 million US in this form of advice and assistance. And we're pretty proud of the job we're doing in defending democracy.
But should private entities be more careful in getting involved in such conflicts? What problems can arise?
Well, that's a very good question. First thing is, these companies then have to reconcile themselves to not getting any more business in Russia, and that's a decision that they've made. They've obviously decided that that's a sacrifice they need to make. The head of Microsoft, Brad Smith, has made the point that because of the nature of the internet cyber operations, that this is a new frontier where governments don't have a monopoly. And if they want to be effective, they have to bring in the private sector in what Microsoft is calling public-private partnerships in warfare, in signals warfare, in cyber war. Now, that immediately raises a whole host of questions, including at what point do commercial considerations cut in? For example, in the case of Microsoft, which is proudly talking about defending democracy, at the same time, they've got a substantial business in China. Are they talking about pulling back their business in China because of their newfound support for democracy abroad? No, they're not. They're in fact signaling that they're going to barrel ahead with expansion in China. So there are limits to these big tech companies' supposed values and principles, and that's going to pose difficult moments for them. For example, as the US and China continue with this economic decoupling, especially in the technology realm, these companies are going to come under pressure to get really serious about just how far they're prepared to go in defence of democratic systems and principles.
How closely do you think governments should be monitoring them?
Well, from what I can gather, the US government seems pretty satisfied that they're getting assistance on the same team from some of the big tech companies, not all, but some. And of course, the Ukrainians are only too happy to have this force multiplier of multiple sources of fresh and live intelligence coming to them.
Peter Hartcher, always good to talk. Thank you.
Pleasure, Yvonne.